we are in a season of moving forward into renovation. We love our two 100-seat venues that we currently have, but we're really looking forward to combining both and sitting all together in one new 350-seat venue. Is anybody excited about that? It's going to be a game changer. Now, just because we move into a new space doesn't mean that it solves all the problems. We've just learned over 10 years of ministry that every new thing comes with its own unique set of problems. So just when we get there doesn't mean we've arrived. That just means we're making more room for more people. And so we're in the middle of that. In fact, I'm going to have more information on the build-out and hopefully a cost to share with you next Sunday. I hope you'll come back and bring somebody with you. It'll be an exciting Sunday as well. Another thing, though, that Pastor Frank shared was I thought his message was not only practical, but even prophetic for our church. He said, this is going to happen. Speaking of the renovation, he said, this is going to happen. So when you sit in the new future venue, he asked the question, will you have been a part of building it, or will you have just received all of the sacrifice from everybody else? And man, what a great thought that we're all in this together. And so we're praying that God would move us into this new season where we can clear chairs. Obviously, at the 10 o'clock, we're just completely out of room. Have been for quite a while. And so we're praying for more room for more people. And one of the big prayer requests we're praying for is that we would all lean into this so that we would be able to pay for the construction in cash, move in without having to continue to pay on it, which we would love to. It would be miraculous in many ways. And a miracle is what I want to talk to you about today, but maybe not in the way you're expecting it. I want to talk to you today from the book of Numbers, chapter 11. And I want to talk to you about not only miracles, but how to ruin the miracle. So I want to share a message with you today that I'm calling Miracles Are Expensive. From Numbers chapter 11. You got to count the cost on everything. I mean, like if you've gone to the mall, you go shopping, it's always frustrating when you grab that clothing item off of the sales rack and then you take it to the front and it's not actually on sale. And then you have to make a decision while there's 10 people who are not interested in standing in line much longer behind you, and you have to make a decision. Do I put it back? I didn't want to pay this much for it, but do I want it? You have to make that decision. There's all kinds of times in life where you have to decide, is it worth the cost? We're constantly making decisions based on value. Is it worth it? And in Numbers chapter 11, we're in this place where we need to learn the importance of counting the cost when we ask God to provide something. Now, let me kind of catch you up. If you were here 2 weeks ago at the launch of 2020, launch of Together We Build, we started the year off in Exodus chapter 16. If you remember, Israel was fresh on the heels of victory as God led them, provided Moses, and led them out of Egypt and into the wilderness. And in Exodus chapter 16, the nation of Israel began crying out to God to provide food for them in the wilderness, bread in particular. And if you remember, God provided bread in the form of this stuff that they called manna. It was kind of this honey-flavored, wafer-like food that every morning they would wake up to and collect for the day. And so they called it manna. Do you guys remember what manna means? What is it? That's what it means. They got real creative with that name. They're like, what is it? We'll just call it that. It was God's provision. And so God miraculously provided for them. So by the time we catch up to them in Numbers chapter 11, that's been happening for over a year now. If you can imagine, daily, actually 6 of the 7 days a week, on the 6th day, God provided double so that they could collect double and take the Sabbath off, because God set the pace with rest, taking a day off. That's important. And so he provided. For over a year now, they have been waking up to God's provision. God's done a whole bunch of other things. He's been leading them through the wilderness, a pillar of cloud, a pillar of fire. They've, by this point in Numbers 11, built the tabernacle. They've ordained priests. They've received the 10 commandments. In fact, in so many ways, too many for us to count, their freedom and God's presence in their camp is miraculous. What God is doing in their midst is a miraculous thing. In fact, 2 weeks ago, to take you back, one thing that I asked you guys to do, we spent a couple moments during the message doing some personal inventory and writing down some things, thinking about some things that God has done miraculously in our lives and in our church. In fact, here in the North venue, we got to pass around the mic and hear some quick stories of how God has worked miracles in our lives. And I had you write something down. I'm going to revisit this here in a moment. I had you write something down that day as we talked about the great things that God was doing. I had you write this down. We are walking in a miracle. It's so important for us to understand and put ourselves in this story because the nation of Israel was walking in a miracle. We need to be reminded that God is moving in our day and we are walking in a miracle. But here's where we're going today with the message. The longer you're in a miracle, the easier it is to lose sight of the miracle, to lose the awe of the miracle. Numbers chapter 11. Watch this, verse 1. It says, the people complained in the hearing of the Lord about their misfortunes. And when the Lord heard it, his anger was kindled, and the fire of the Lord burned among them and consumed some outlying parts of the camp. The people cried out to Moses, and Moses prayed to the Lord, and the fire died down. So the name of that place was called Taberah, because the fire of the Lord burned among them. Now the rabble that was among them had a strong craving, and the people of Israel also wept again and said, "Oh, that we had meat to eat. Remember the fish we ate in Egypt that cost nothing, the cucumbers, the melons, the leeks, the onions, the garlic. Now our strength is dried up, and there's nothing at all but this manna to look at." Do you remember 2 weeks ago, I had you write down the definition of manna? We talked about this, and I said manna is God's miraculous provision. I told you 2 weeks ago we'd come back to it. And here we are. God's miraculous provision. I want us to think of manna as God's miraculous provision. And with that definition in mind, I want to reread verse 6 that we just read. Watch this. Numbers 11, verse 6. But now our strength is dried up. They're whining. And there is nothing at all but this miraculous provision to look at. Isn't that amazing how when you're in the middle of a miracle, you can get used to it and you can start to treat the blessing you prayed for as a burden that you now have to bear. If we're not careful, we can start to do the same thing that the nation of Israel did. And I want to warn you about this because when the blessing that you prayed for begins to feel less like a blessing and more like a burden, it's not that God's provision has changed. It's that your perspective on the blessing has changed. And it's time to realign something. It's time for us to figure out what went wrong and how do I need to reshape how I'm looking at whatever it is that God has given me. So I want to give you 3 things today along the lines of this miracle. And I want to start with something that'll ruin it. Number 1, write this down. Complaining will ruin the miracle. Now, God is very secure, okay? He's not an insecure leader that gets super bothered and insecure when we complain to him. So he can handle our complaints. In fact, I would say this. I don't think that complaining in and of itself is innately bad. In fact, in many ways, it's biblical to tell God what's going on in your life. But for every complaint, I think there should probably be like 100 reminders of how good God is. Let's balance out the negativity a little bit more in our lives. But here's the problem with complaining. The problem with complaining is not what it does to God. The problem with complaining is what it does to us. It sets us down this path that begins to change everything around us. I want you to notice the progression here in verses 1 through 4. You'll notice in verse 1, as soon as they start complaining, the anger of the Lord is burning, and it literally turns into a fire. It says in verse 1, and the outside parts of the camp catch on fire. It's part of the consequences of this, that the land began to burn. And Moses prays for them. The fire dies down. But what's interesting is that in verse 3, the fire, must have been so bad that it charred and scarred the land so badly that area in the wilderness took on a new identity, a new name. The name now, according to verse 3, was Taberah, which means burning. So from this point forward, after the nation of Israel left, when other groups of people would come by that same spot, they would now call it Taberah, because their complaining led to a whole new identity and even a look of this geographical location. But not only did it change their surroundings, it even changed part of their identity. Verses 1 through 3, the nation of Israel is called the people, or the people of God. But did you catch their name in verse 4? Now they're called the rabble, which is not a word that we typically use, but it's now a new word in the arsenal of parents when they have a group of kids whining, okay? Because if you call them, here's the good news, if you call them rabble, your kids won't even know what you're talking about, all right? And you're being biblical, okay? It says the rabble that was among them. They take on a whole new identity. The word rabble means a group of complainers with the focus on what they're complaining about. And now the moms in the room are like, I got a couple of those in my house. They took on actually a whole new identity. And then what's crazy is that in verse 4, as it continues, it says that even after the fire had died down, the rabble, the complainers, they had a strong craving, and it says they wept again. They wept again. Now, I know it's easy for us to read the Bible and be like, those Israelites. But let's be honest about how much we relate to this, where we don't even want to own how familiar this territory is for us. The moment God provides something for us, we are very quick to find something else to gripe about because we have a strong craving, and I'll cry again over something, right? So here, that's exactly where they end up. Now, let me tell you something about a miracle. The fastest way to ruin a miracle is to act as though God owed you the miracle. Let me say that again. The fastest way to destroy what God has done in your life is to act as though He owed it to you in the first place and just get used to living in the miracle. It's the fastest way to destroy it. And we do this in more ways than one, by the way. When we pray for God to heal, and He doesn't heal in our time and in our way, and we get bitter toward Him, we're acting as though God owed us the miracle, right? When we're walking in something that's difficult and we're asking God to change it, for instance, your marriage maybe, it's really struggling, and you're wondering why God hasn't fixed it yet. God, you want my husband, my wife to be saved even more than I do. Why haven't you done that yet? And we start to get bitter toward God as though He owed us the miracle. Or maybe you're single and you've been praying for years for a spouse and it hasn't happened yet, and you're starting to lower the bar and get angry toward God. Listen, God doesn't owe us a miracle. Can we just own this today? That if God never answered one more prayer for us, He's already done way more than we ever deserved. You with me? He doesn't owe us anything. Actually, He does owe us something, but we don't want to talk about what He owes us. He certainly owes us no blessings. And so the fastest way to ruin what God has done is to think that He owes it to you. So here's an idea. How about instead of feeling entitled to the blessing, let's be intentional at remaining indebted to God's grace. How about instead of cultivating this idea that God owes me some sort of blessing, let's be really intentional at being on our knees, on our faces, and just saying, God, you don't owe me anything, and I am eternally in debt to your grace. I'm just thankful. Complaining will ruin the miracle. Now, they complained before, by the way. They're complaining again right here. They complained for meat before. God provided. Now they're back at it. And now, if you saw this in verse 5, they start to get really, really into this menu that they're creating for the Lord. Verse 5, we remember the fish we ate in Egypt that cost nothing. And the cucumbers. You remember the cucumbers? Oh, and the melons. You remember the melons and the leeks? And they had those onion rings. You know what I'm talking about? They had those Egyptian onion rings and with the garlic crust, you know? Like it's all basted on there. I can taste it. My mouth is watering. They're complaining about what they had in Egypt. Write this down. Ready? Grumbling kills gratitude and distorts reality. We talked about this in week 1, that the way to get ahead of the grumbling is gratitude. So we want to make sure and regularly thank God for how good he is. But it works vice versa as well. Because not only does gratitude kill grumbling, but grumbling kills gratitude. And it will distort your reality. Did you see this? They said in verse 5 that the fish in Egypt cost them nothing. Except for your freedom. Like, did you forget that the whole reason you were eating fish in Egypt is because you were the slaves of the Egyptians? And like let's be honest, the only reason the Egyptians fed the Israelites fish was to keep them alive so that they could bake more bricks and build more buildings. That was the whole point. But when we start grumbling, it distorts our reality. And we start to get this selfish, sinful, selective memory that just like Israel, they started to forget all the bad things of their slavery. They forgot the whips. They forgot the long days. They forgot that at one point, the Pharaoh made them sacrifice their newborn sons so that the nation of Israel couldn't grow any longer. That's called infanticide, killing the infants. They forgot that. Because our sinful, selfish memory gets so selective that all we can remember is the good when we actually had it really bad. But grumbling will do this to us, and our selfishness begins to make our memory selective and our reality distorted. Let me give you a word of warning, because people do this all the time in lots of different circumstances. This is why some people stay in a sinful dating relationship way longer than they ever should. Because when they try to get out, their boyfriend or girlfriend just helps them remember all the good times. And they forget the black eyes. And they forget the shame that they felt because of the sin that they lived in. This is why we settle for things that we get addicted to. Because we remember in the moment when we're feeling so down that if I turn to that thing, it makes me feel so good. Our memory gets selective. We don't remember the hangover. We don't remember so much the jail time. We don't remember the risk that we had to go to get that next high. We just remember how good it felt when we got it. And so grumbling distorts our reality. This is why people walk away from God. Because the devil reminds them how good they had it in their sin and how much fun it was, and brings to remembrance all of the hard times of following Jesus. And so when we're only grumbling, when we can't remember how good God is and we're just reminded of how hard our lives are, this is where this begins to spin out in our lives. So let's talk about the solution. How do we deal with this? The solution, let me be clear, is not denial. It's not even downplaying your pain. In fact, the solution to this is not even so much stop complaining. Okay? What I'm not saying here is that when life is tough, we need to just put on a smile and pretend like everything's okay. That's not it at all. I think one of the first steps is to adjust our perspective, balance out the negativity with a whole bunch of positivity. Think about how good God is. That's one of the first steps. But I think the long-lasting step here, the thing that will take us through even when life is hard, is learning to trust God and his timing and the process, even when it's not on your timeline and done in the way that you want it to be done. Could we trust God enough to say, God, this is not how I would have done it. And I certainly would have ended this pain a long time ago. But I trust you that there is in some way some purpose in my pain. And I'm going to keep walking through the tears, through the challenges. I'm not at all trying to downplay your pain or say it doesn't exist or ask you to pretend like it doesn't. But listen, through the tears and through the struggle, can you trust God enough to still say, my God's so good? Even while I need a box of Kleenex to dry my tears, my God is so good. He always has been. That's not going to change now just because my life isn't great. My circumstances aren't comfortable. Let's not be so selective in our memory that it begins to distort our reality. Because I think the danger is that we would let toxic negativity ruin the miracle. Israel has had God's miraculous provision day in and day out, and they've lost their perspective. We can do the same thing. Now, I think a lot of the problem is the cost. As we're learning today, miracles are expensive. God's provision comes with a price tag. Here's a third thought that I hope will speak to you where you need it. Don't pray for what you won't pay for. Come on. There's too many of us that are going to pray for great things, but when it comes to any sort of sacrifice that goes into seeing that miracle happen, we're out. Don't pray for it if you're not willing to pay something for it, to put something behind it, to take a step of faith, to make some action in this, right? Because listen, we're not earning miracles, but I want to also tell you that God doesn't just hand out freebies, right? You're like, well, what about the promised land that he gave to the nation of Israel? Well, sure, he gave it to them, but they had to fight for it. You remember that? How about the walls of Jericho? Well, that one came free, sure, after they did it in God's way, in God's timing. The nation of Israel, I mean, to receive God's miraculous provision for them, I mean, they had to take scary steps of faith. They had to fight harsh enemies. There are many people who lost their lives trying to take hold of God's miraculous provision for them. Are you willing to lean in sacrificially and trust God to pay for? Are you willing to pay for what you've been praying for? And I think here's part of the problem. God wants us moving, but the devil wants us sitting. Have you ever felt that tension? Like, I know I'm supposed to take that step of faith. I know I'm supposed to give here. I know I'm supposed to, but it's so easy, and you hear some little whisper telling you, just take a seat and get comfortable. There's always this tension. There's always this battle between our flesh, the devil stirring us up, and the Lord telling us, come on, let's go. Inviting you in to take a step. I know it's scary. I know walking by faith isn't easy. God wants us moving. So don't pray for it if you're not willing to pay for it. Can I just speak that to somebody? Remember that when the blessing you prayed for now feels like a burden that you're bearing. The marriage, the spouse that you prayed for it. So remember that you prayed for it when the thing God blessed you with now is in a season of feeling more like a burden. Maybe I'm speaking to some parents who prayed for kids. Come on now. And sometimes they sound and feel and smell less like blessings and more like burdens, if we're being totally honest. Remember this. When the business you were so excited to start up and prayed for and God miraculously provided for turns difficult. Don't pray for it if you're not willing to pay for it. Remember this, when the church building is expensive, we're not just going to talk about building the Lord's house and wait for the lottery to drop, right? Like, I don't know how you thought maybe that God was going to provide for this build out. It won't come by us praying and kicking up our feet and waiting for money to rain down from the heavens. That's not how God works. He goes, I would love to answer that prayer. Are you willing to pay for it? Are you willing to trust me? Are you willing to lean in and sacrifice to see it happen? God wants to use us to see a miracle in our day. But are you willing to pay for it? Or are you just going to sit back and pray for it and hope that it works? There's sacrifice involved. There's a price tag involved in the miracle. See, the miracles don't happen when we just kick our feet up. Miracles happen when we take steps of faith and we fight the enemy. But that's where the battle is. And if you won't pay for it, I would just tell you, don't even worry about praying for it. Let's own the fact that there's sacrifice. There's a price tag attached to that thing that you're asking God for. You didn't think that good thing would come without a fight, right? You didn't think that your kid would turn back to the Lord without a battle, did you? You didn't think that following God would just be easy and he would remove all your problems, did you? No, it's going to come with a fight. God's going to do a miracle, and you should keep praying for that miracle, but just know when you pray for it, the day's going to come where you'll be asked, are you willing to pay for it? You're not buying the miracle. Don't get me wrong here. You're not buying the miracle, but you're partnering with God as you trust him to do the miracle. There's sacrifice involved. So there's a price tag on God's provision, but can I tell you this? There's a price tag on your soul as well. Let me drive this home, because really Together We Build is way less about a building and way more about people who need Jesus. Let's just be honest about this, right? Like when we sit in the new venue, we have not arrived. We're just starting. More room for more people. We need more chairs so we can fill up the empty chairs with empty people who need to be filled up with Jesus. That's the whole idea here. Together we build. We're in this together. More room, more people. We're clearing room so that this would be the year that launches us into this decade, that God does more in us in 2020 than he's ever done in a year before, that we see God move in a powerful way. But please, I've been telling our staff this, let's not settle for a moment thinking that when we get to the venue, it will be easy to get there, as though then when we sit there, we've arrived. Not at all. It's going to come with a battle. It's going to come with a cost. There's going to be challenges along the way. We're 10 years into ministry, and it's been amazing, and man, there's been a high price tag on this. It's cost us a lot along the way. Your soul has a price tag. Here's the cost. Romans 6:23. The wages, the price for your sin and mine is death. Now, here's the problem with that. Here's the problem with that payment plan. You don't have to pay it right away, so you start to feel comfortable with it. Here's how King Solomon put it in Ecclesiastes chapter 8. He says, when a crime is not punished quickly, people feel it is safe to do wrong. And so because there's a delay on the consequences, we start to feel safe in our sin. Well, I've never gotten caught. Well, I've been in this relationship for years and nobody's found out. Well, I've been going to that website now for quite a while and I've done a good job covering my tracks. I just drink on the weekends or while she's out of town. She doesn't even know. Right? And because we've not gotten caught, we feel it's safe to do it. Because the consequences are not immediate. See, think about this in our daily lives. If you were driving through a 50-mile-an-hour speed zone, and the moment your speedometer hit 51, lights went on in your rearview mirror and you got a ticket, you would immediately connect the crime with the payment. And you would say, I'm not going to speed anymore. But because you've blown through some school zones before, and you have a lead foot, and you're late to work, and all of the other excuses that we have, and because you've gotten away with it, and it seems like the payment is delayed, then we get comfortable in our sin. Let me put it to you this way. A life of sin is like a shopping spree on a credit card. You still have to pay for it. It's just delayed in the payment. And so it's fun while you're at it, but I guess I'm just here to warn you that the lifestyle of sin is going to catch you. You can't just do it and not pay for it. So the bottom line is this: either you pay for it or you let Jesus pay for it. And so I know that's kind of heavy, but here's the good news. Let me wrap this up with some good news. God saw the price tag on your soul, and he sent Jesus, his only son, to pay the debt that you and I owed. And the reason we have hope in life is because Jesus gave his blood. This is good news of the gospel, that because of Jesus, we have life. The greatest miracle, we're talking today about how miracles are expensive. The greatest miracle, your salvation and mine, came at the highest cost: Jesus' death. He loved you enough to give it all. I guess my question for you is, do you love him enough to give him